Good afternoon. It's 3 p.m. I'm going to call to order the Committee of the Whole meeting for Wednesday, April 10th, 2019. Look for adoption of the agenda. I understand there is an amendment. Director Stewart?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add an item onto the agenda for a reserve balance update. It'll be a verbal presentation. Item 5.3.
Item 5.3, okay. Anybody else have anything to add to the agenda? No? Motion to adopt as amended? Moved, seconded, all in favor? Oh, yes, and of course, because I heard him, we also have Eric on the phone, so he can't be with us today. Excuse me, Councillor Scott. We have no appointments or delegations today. Item 4, any new business to discuss before we go into our agenda? No? Excellent. Item 5.1, 2019 municipal property tax rates. First, a motion to receive the report from the Director of Corporate and Financial Services. Moved, seconded, all in favor? Thank you very much.
Aye.
And we'll turn it over to the Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the presentation today is to really look at the municipal property tax rates. Essentially, the budget's been set. Now, the question would be what rate you want to charge each individual property class. So I thought I'd just go through a quick presentation on how we get to these rates and then what your options are at the end there. So basically, on March 27th, the Committee in the Whole, that's wild, I endorsed a property tax increase of 8.45%, 5.45% for operating activities, 3% for capital. So then we try to calculate the property tax rate for each class of property. So the steps we take would be to adjust the prior year rate. This would take into account increases in assessed values. Then apply the approved tax rate increase to all the tax rates equally. We calculate the current taxes by property class, and then finally it's determination of whether we want to shift the tax burden between classes, which is ultimately this committee's discretion. So the first thing we do is to adjust the prior year rate to account for the increase in assessed values. So what's showing here is the assessed values from 2018 and the 2019 assessed values. This is prior to accounting for growth, which is referred to as the non-market change. So this is new construction, what have you. This is just the value of the homes that existed prior to 2018. So you can see the change there is approximately 12% for residential, 7% for utilities, 6% for industry, 11% for business, managed forests, etc. So then what I do is I take that rate and we adjust it by the percent change in the assessment. So you can see the 2018 rate for residential of 2.27339 is then revised to be 2.02838. And that's done for each property class based on its particular change in the class. What this ultimately achieves is, as you can see in this chart, is the taxes collected from each class remains the same. So you can see on the residential line there on that fourth column, the 2018 levy about 2.7 million. If you use the 2019 values prior to growth, add in the revised tax rate, you can see the amount collected is approximately the same. There's always slight rounding errors because you're talking about $1 billion times a 5-digit number. But essentially, this is a 0% increase. The only one that's really noticeably not changing here, or changing a lot, sorry, is the utility class. And that's simply because we charge $40 as the assessed rate. What the Act allows is to charge 2.5 times the commercial rate or $40, whichever is greater. So we charge the 40, so it can't go up just because the assessments go down. So, but because the assessments went up slightly, we get more money from them. The idea is to keep the utility at $40. So it's a slight increase in revenue, but ultimately the idea here is every class still pays the same. This is on the assumption that the people, whatever you paid last year in taxes, you'd pay the same this year in taxes. Again, assuming your assessment changed by exactly the average of all. Okay, oops, I had done some neat graphics here and I forgot to do it as I was pointing out each thing. So as you can see, we take the original number, change it, and there's the percent changes is primarily 0 across the board. We then take the tax rate approved by council and it's applied across each class of property equally again. So we take the revised tax rate, multiply by the 8.45%, and these become our new tax rates for 2019. So this would apply, basically achieve 8.45% to all properties of all classes across the board. Again, assuming their assessments within their group remain static. So this sort of is the proof of that. So you can see we've taken the new assessed values, added the new rate, add the tax from before growth, and there's the increase in revenue from each class of property, and it's around 8.45%. We then take this tax rate and we then add in the growth number. And as you can see, that's how we come up with the total revenue, including growth. So $143,000 in that second to last column in new growth to the district, total revenue of just over $9.3 million. So then the question then becomes if you want to shift the tax burden between properties. So this is just some comparatives to show sort of what happened between years. This year, because the increases were relatively the same, approximately 11% for all classes, the change between everything didn't really change that much. So you can see here, the residential class, the percentage of total assessments increased from 93.8% to 93.9%. And the business class went down slightly. That's really primarily because of the growth number, because most of the growth happened in the residential sector. If you look at the total taxes paid, again, you can see the residential class went up by about 0.2%. The business class went down by 0.2%. Again, that's because of the shift primarily from the growth. What then plays into this is the tax rate multiple. And this is where basically you look at the comparison of the residential rate to all the other rates across the board. Because we're doing a straight increase, so everyone's paying the same amount, because of the change in assessments and total taxes, the multiple then becomes the number that changes. So you can see here, the multiple for business class went from 2.37 to 2.39, simply as a result of the math exercise. So really the question for you, and primarily we do it between the residential and the business and let the other numbers fall where they may, is do you want to keep the increase static across the board, or would you like to do something either with the business class or the residential class to shift the tax burden between those two classes? So looking at it here, as you can see, 2.39 is the new tax rate multiple, and the levy relative to the calculation is 0 across the board. If you were to decide to increase the multiple to 2.49, which would actually put more burden on the business sector, the business class or sector as a whole would pay $41,000 more in taxes. The residential class would see approximately a $41,000 reduction in their taxes. And conversely, if you wanted to reduce the multiple, I'm doing it by 0.1 each time, you can see that $41,000 is then shifted to residential away from the business class. So that's really your option you want to be dealing with. Just for comparison purposes, this is the 2018 business class multiple. We were at 2.37. The proposal we have is moved to 2.39. This is a comparison of municipalities. I believe we picked the ones from about 8,000 population to 12,000 population, the entire group across the province, to see how we ranked. So as you can see, our multiple is somewhat in the middle there, although it's not sorted by multiples, oddly enough. And just so you're aware of where we've been at for recent years, starting in 2019, the multiple was 2.05. It was increased or sort of decreased to 2. It remained at 2. So that was the number primarily in those prior years from 2011 to 16, as the multiple was kept fixed and the taxes between each class was different, or the percentage increase was different between each class by keeping the multiple the same. Starting in 2017, we kept the percentage increase the same, therefore the multiple changed from 2.21 to 2.37, and ultimately this year to 2.29. So the recommendation is not to change the multiple and to have the tax rate increase be equal, 8.45 across the board, and with that, this would be the tax rates that I'm recommending we go with. I do have a spreadsheet, so if you do want to play with the multiple and see what it would do, that is an option for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Stewart. Questions? Comments? Thank you for the presentation. Nothing? Councillor Lamb? Councillor Scott, do you have anything?
No, I'm good here.
Okay. Well, I'll say something then. And I'm both a homeowner and a business owner here in Seashelt, in discussions with my wife, we'd rather pay more taxes at our business. And for us, it's easier as a tax write-off, things like that. Of course, allowing the multiplier to creep up provides unfair advantages to home-based businesses, mobile vendors, et cetera. There's a balance there, of course. Somewhere down the road, we need to look at business licensing fees too, perhaps, but I mean, I certainly don't want to lower it, but yeah, if anybody else has anything they want to say. Councillor Lamb?
So I'm just like wondering, kind of where we're at today, like, because we're saying that we're going for $9.374 million we need to raise this year in taxes, and you know, I just don't. We're setting that goal, but are we? You know, we haven't gone. I mean, as much as we've had a look at the budget already. I mean, what happens if we come back to the budget and want to achieve less? If we can achieve less than that, you know, then is this set in stone now that this is the money that we're going to raise, or can we rearrange the budget or make changes to the budget so that we raise less money?
Nothing's set in stone yet. Until this goes to the bylaw to council, this committee can do whatever it wishes.
Anybody else? Do you have a follow-up, Councillor Lamb?
I guess just for myself, I'm really struggling with, you know, with the increase in the budget and how we, you know, how you move forward. You know, it's not about this budget, but it's the future budgets as we move along. And I just see that if we don't start getting a hold of the budget, you can see double-digit budgets. I mean, they're just going to become the norm. And so, you know, I think that we just have to have a real, you know, a real serious look at how we move forward with this budget, and yeah, just, you know, try and make some good decisions for our community and how we move on.
Thank you. I mean, it's always a thing to be keeping a mind on and keeping an eye on. For the director, if the budget itself changes much, will this have much impact in your calculations? If we pass, we want to keep it static, will that have much impact on your further work? Like, will we have to see this again, is what I guess I'm asking.
Not necessarily. If the committee passed a resolution to say simply, when it's time to apply the tax rate, do it equally across the board, I would then know what calculation to use. If it was to change the multiple, that then would probably require a different discussion.
Okay. Councillor Rowe?
Just a question. Originally, when the budget first came out, you had a number of what it would cost, I think $600,000 household in increased taxes for the year, based on that original budget that came out. I think it was 177 or something like that. Do we have that number for this 8.45?
I did the math.
Oh, sorry, it's okay.
Councillor McLean.
Councillor McLean has done the math.
So the average house price in 2018 was $636,000. The average inflation or increase in assessment would put that average house up to $713,000 in 2019. So last year that gave us, with the previous house value and the previous year's taxes, it gave a value of $14.47 in District of Sechelt, the core tax. And now with that increased value and all the rates that we're proposing at the current levels, it's up to $15.69, which is a difference of $122. And I would welcome any comments if my assumptions are wrong.
That sounds right.
Okay. Councillor Kuster?
Just for clarity, Tom, my question, are you proposing that we go back and look at the actual 8.45 and stream that percent increase? Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah, yes, yeah. And just the, I guess, yeah, each line item and just go through and just have a real serious look at it.
Thank you. Not pursuant necessarily to the business today, but Mayor Segers?
Thank you. So if we wanted to do that, if we moved this forward today and then had a detailed look at the budget, how would that impact this? Just the percentage at the end, potentially? So the split would still be the same as based on here?
Ultimately, if the committee wanted to keep the increase equal across the board, you changed it to 7% or 8%, then yes, it would just change the rate equally.
And ultimately, that's our discussion for this item for today, is whether we're keeping the ratio between residential and business the same, or whether we want to change that value at all, regardless of where the budget itself as a whole ends up. So we do have a recommendation here, recommendation 2, that the committee recommend to council that the District of Sechelt 2019 property tax rates be set as shown in Schedule 1 in Attachment 1 in this report, which is what's on the screen now. Councillor McLean?
So as this is written, it is a little prescriptive in that it would define every tax amount. So to give us the flexibility that Councillor Lamb may be looking for, I think a better written version of this is to set the business rate multiplier to 2.39 as proposed. And I'd welcome any staff comments if that provides the needed direction for this decision.
Yes, it would actually. That would, if that was the case, it would result in equal tax across the board.
So you're wanting to amend the motion to read that the committee recommend to council that the District of Sechelt 2019 property tax rates be, or that the commercial multiplier be targeted at 2.39%?
Yeah.
Okay.
Times.
Thank you. Seconder for that? All right. All those in favor of the amendment? Okay.
Aye.
So the newly amended recommendation 2. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, it's not necessary to look at that as an amendment because
Okay.
you simply have a recommendation in front of you. You've sort of wordsmithed it and it's fine the way it is.
Okay. There was no amendment. So we moved that recommendation. Okay. All right. Thank you. Everybody's got to learn sometime.
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
Pardon me?
If I could just get some clarification of how the committee would like to proceed now. My goal was to come to the next council meeting with a budget bylaw and a tax rate bylaw for adoption, but I'm assuming that's not what the committee wants to do at this point. So.
Mayor Segers?
It sounds like the councillors would like to dig back into the numbers to get some clarity around how that would be the 5.35, right? 5.35?
4.5.
5.45. It was made up, and I don't know what format we do that in. If we do it in a public meeting, if we do a workshop and everybody brings their questions, but that's something that I think we'd need to get on fairly quickly in order to meet your timeline. Does that work?
It does. We'll likely have to have a special council meeting, but that'll be in early May.
Okay, sounds good.
We don't need a motion for that, for you to come back? Okay. Okay. All right, so I guess we're moving on to item 5.2, septage pardon me? Anything for the class council? Septage disposal costs and fees. Motion to receive the report from the manager of financial services. Moved, seconded. All those in favor? All right. Turn it over to you, Mr. Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My report today brings forward a request from the committee for staff to provide a review of the district septage receiving costs, the impact of costs of the septage treated at the Water Resource Center, for us to ensure the funds are reserved for aging infrastructure, capital replacement, possible relocation, and post-closure costs. We've determined that the total for the district's function for receiving septage waste, we've isolated the costs in the budget, and as a result of our findings, we recommend a 15% increase to the general biosolids disposal fee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mayor Seegers.
Thank you. Given that one of the line items in here is transfer to Water Resource Center, et cetera, if we look at doing any of the other changes, would this be impacted as well? Because that is typically it's based on admin fees and different kinds of things. So would that impact this at all? And would that impact what we passed today?
No, it's been included on other spreadsheets, which would then transfer across to what's recommended through sewer. We're not recommending any increases through sewer parcel fees or sewer user fees this year, so this would not impact sewer at all.
Councillor McLean.
So the logic behind this makes a lot of sense, going for revenue neutral operation of the center. The cost distribution is a little more challenging. So it's proposed that the general rate increase by 15%, which is fair. A concern I have is with holding tanks. So I understand that we provide a grant to people with approved holding tanks for good reasons, I assume, near water courses or wherever else they may need them. But the previous rate was, I believe, 1.1 cents after the credit. We're keeping the credit amount the same, and it's increasing to 4.16 cents. So is that a 400% increase? Am I understanding this correct, effectively?
Recommendation 2, actually. Looking at the math that's been provided here, it still results in a 1.1 cent per gallon rate.
Okay, I see that, yeah. I missed that.
I missed
in
it the
reading.
first time too, it's all
Okay.
good. Any other questions? Oh. Mr. Curry?
Yeah, I just wanted to include that the refund to holding tank property owners would remain the same. We've estimated that the refund is fair, and the cost that the holding tank property owners are paying for the refusal is fair, and based on a comparison that we had done. This is back when we changed the structure of the bylaw, I believe 2 years ago, to come to that. We're still at the same point as far as leaving that refund amount at the same value.
Would it be of benefit to us and to staff and to the public, in the name of transparency, to include in the expenses the refunds that are being issued just as a total item, just for future?
We can do that going forward. Currently it's included in the revenue, so just the same as it was before. So it's It would just be, you would see if it was approximately $10,000 a year, you'd see the increase of $10,000 to the revenue, and then I'd add it as an expenditure below. So we could do that change.
I think it would be appreciated. I know that I did receive some specific questions regarding that, so. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Councillor Scott, do you have anything?
No, I think it all makes sense. It's the increase is fair, as Councilor McLean stated, so I'm good with it.
Okay. Does anybody want to move recommendation 2 as presented? Moved, seconded? Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Moving on to item 5.3, reserve balance update. I don't know who wants to speak to this. It's going to be Director Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just thought, based on some questions I've been hearing, that it might be beneficial just to go through again just the reserves and what's in the budget now, just so you sort of understand sort of where we're at, what's been happening, and the balances that we anticipate. So I just basically pulled it all together into one little presentation for you to hopefully give you an update and satisfaction as to where we're doing. So looking at the operating budget, the following items are listed or are in the budget now to be funded from reserves. There's a couple pages here, so I'll go through them. So the deferred operating reserve, this is really, and this is a reserve that isn't really carried over from year to year. It's money primarily that is not spent in one year, that's carried over, particularly for the second 2 items here, the office equipment and the training expenses. These are expenses that were just anticipated to be spent, and for whatever reason, we just didn't get to them during the year. The office equipment, we were looking to buy some chairs. We just basically ran out of time in the year, so the order was placed early in the year, so the money's just reserved and carried over simply because year end occurred, so it's a new fiscal year for us. So in the deferred operating reserve, this is where we propose to fund the part-time building inspection staff. Essentially, this money came from increased building revenue last year, really on the assumption that often the inspection revenue is received, but we don't incur the expense until the next fiscal year simply because of timing. So this is the idea that the money, we had about $80,000 last year, so the money was put away and then brought forward in 2019. The sewer modeling, that was a project that was actually in last year's budget, didn't occur. It was actually in the year before, actually. So again, the money's already been taxed for, so the idea is not to tax again for the same project. It's a finite project that will get completed ultimately. So again, it's money that's being reserved, and as mentioned, the office equipment and the training budget. So the deferred operating reserve, we're drawing $199,000 out of it, and as you can see, that's actually what's in the reserve at this point. We have the SCIFI Reserve, that's the Small Community Infrastructure Investment Fund. It's basically provincial money that small communities get. Several years ago, not all the money was spent, and it was put in a reserve. It was actually prior to my arrival in Sechelt. So there's a balance in there, so we're just proposing that 2 projects be funded from that, the senior planning table and the downtown Wi-Fi. Really, for those 2 cases, is really until council decides whether they want to make those a permanent expenses or not at all. From the development fees reserve, again, this was a reserve that was set up many years ago. I'm not sure exactly when. It's based, I think it was ultimately the same idea as the building permit fees. Must have had a good year in development permit. The money was put aside. And so we're proposing this year to fund some planning consulting work, basically to increase the budget for the planning department to get some more planning work done. And the bylaw 430 review, which was funded last year from this reserve but hasn't occurred yet. It was $80,000. It's just starting now. So again, that project's been carried over, and we've just kept the funding the same as what was in last year's budget. The Community Forest Dividend Reserve. This is the Community Investment Program is actually funding. This is the same thing that was done last year. This is different than the Community Forest Legacy, which is the statutory reserve that we put aside from the dividends that are received. On an annual basis, we get what's called an ordinary dividend from the community forest of the $25,890. For several years, it just wasn't being used, and it actually ended up in a reserve because we weren't spending the money. So we started, and it's supposed to be used towards community program, so we're now using it to fund the community investment program or part of it. Ultimately, that reserve will run out, and we'll have to decide if we want to increase taxes or what to do at that point. And the gas tax reserve, we do have a few operating items being funded from that. There's a sewer modeling project. This is for the modeling out in Davis Bay. Again, it was a project that was included in the 2018 budget to be funded from gas tax, so it's simply carrying over from last year. And the liquid waste management plan, we had $50,000 in last year's budget. A little bit was spent, not much. Again, being funded from the gas tax reserve. The total plan, the total project is about $150,000. So this is to increase add the additional $80,000 or $130,000, sorry, to add the $80,000 and fund it from gas tax as well. Just showing where the reserve balances are. So these are the operating surplus reserve balance. I call them that because really these are non-statutory reserves. This is surplus money the district has that in prior years was earmarked for something. As I said, the top one there being the Small Community Investment Fund. In the prior year, it was decided to actually designate a reserve and set it up there. So that was done. It is ultimately surplus money. It's council's discretion what you want to do with it. There's no restrictions on it. So all of these reserves have no restrictions on them. They've simply been earmarked for a use, but you're not held to that use if you choose to do something else with it. So listed there, what's good, the balance of about $1.2 million at the beginning of this year. The current budget had us taking about $376,000 out. So the balance in those reserves would be $854,000. And these are not reserves that are generally replenished on a regular basis. Again, it's just earmarked money. Just on some of the other non-statutory reserves, I've separated these ones because this money is treated a little bit differently. The public safety reserve actually isn't, but I wanted to separate it because it's got some capital expenses that I hadn't mentioned. So the public safety reserve, this is typically money that comes from vacancies at the RCMP. We budget for a full complement due to transfers, illnesses, injuries on the job. They rarely have their full complement of officers in any given year. So we don't actually usually spend the entire budget. Any unspent money has typically gone into this reserve. In prior years, as you can see, we are using it this year for 3 capital projects, 2 at the RCMP building, and 1 is the Marineway retaining wall. This is actually carryover from 2018 with the work that wasn't done. So we do have in the budget to reduce that reserve by about $368,000, leaving a $500,000 balance. These other 5 reserves there, or sorry, 4 reserves there, are really, again, it's earmarked surplus money, but it has somewhat some conditions behind it if you want, based on what council wants to do. The wharf reserve is any surplus funds generated at the wharf operations. In the past, I believe council would want to return that money back to the wharf for any capital or operating costs associated with it. The affordable housing reserve, again, it is by policy that where that money comes from and what it's to be used for. The CARP reserve is the carbon action money that comes back from the province. It's a rebate of our carbon tax, and it's restricted that we can only use it for reduction of greenhouse gases. So I don't see it as just operating surplus that's undesignated if you want. And finally, the solid waste reserve is again money generated in the solid waste activities. Any surplus money goes into that reserve. I do see potentially using some of that this year if we go to the organics program before year end with not increasing rates, but we're still working on those numbers, but I'm not concerned about the value. I'm sure that'll be sufficient. So as you can see at this point, we're not drawing from any of those 4 reserves. I just thought I'd give you on the gas tax money. I separated it because this one actually has annual contributions associated with it. So you may have heard the UBC just announced a new funding amounts for the gas tax. It's gone up. In the future years, as you can see, the contributions from $485 up to $518,000, and we're getting a bonus payment in 2019. The federal government's allocating another $100 million to BC, and that's being allocated based on the prior year per capita expenses. So the contribution this year is $931,000. So this is basically what would happen in the reserve based on the current contributions that have been announced, the expenses that are identified in the budget and the capital plan. You can see the ending balance starting at starting 2019 at $418,000 and ending up with about $400,000 at the end of 2023. And I just want to look a little bit into the capital funded from taxes, just as more of a refresher if you want. So I put in here the original cost of the original cost of the district's capital assets is about $210 million. The accumulated depreciation on that is about $62 million. So the net book value of $148 million. And the annual depreciation cost is $3.7 million. This is, we take each asset, depreciate it based on its expected useful life. So the calculation is $3.7 million. So you could use that number and assume that our assets are basically going down in value by $3.7 million, unless we spend $3.7 million keeping them as up to date as we can. So that's ultimately what the goal is, what the council has set to us, is to cover the cost of depreciation. So to do that, we'd require a 40% tax increase, or at least when we started this process. So the strategy was to increase taxes 3% a year until that goal was reached. 2019 would be the third year of that strategy, and we'd be collecting current taxes of about $712,000 towards the assets. So I guess it was a bit of a confusion. All of this money would end up going to reserve, and that was really never the intention. The idea would be that if the assets are depreciating by $3.7 million, you probably should be spending $3.7 million maintaining them. But you wouldn't do all that in one shot. The road network, about $60 million, you would end up, you do bits and pieces as you go every year. So that's the idea, is you're spending the money as you go. And the theory being is that any unspent money is then reserved. And that's where you would look at ultimately some larger expenses, such as replacing a roof or a building, or even vehicles for that matter. You would have money in reserve for those expenses as they came along. So I'm putting here, though the actual amounts spending may fluctuate significantly from year to year, depending on what's capital. Ideally, the amount the taxpayers pays remains relatively constant with that 3% increase, but we're not taxing, $1 million one year for capital and $100,000 the next year and having these huge swings in our budget. And then just looking at this is where the reserve balance is anticipated to be. This was based on a 3% increase every year, and the capital plan as it's currently laid out. As you can see, we're starting the year with $662,000. We are spending more this year than we're putting in, but that starts to reverse as of 2020, and by 2023 we actually anticipate having $1.3 million in that reserve. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that there's a lot of, I've heard a lot of questions about that 3% and what it really means. And, we've learned, we've been educated, but having this available is of definite benefit. Repetition is key. Any questions on the presentation? Yeah? Councillor Lamb? No? Councillor Scott, do you have anything?
No, I'll have to get the presentation after. I couldn't see it.
Okay. All right. No questions?
Motion to receive the report.
Oh, thank you. Seconder on that? Seconded? All those in favor? Thank you. I guess no questions. We're moving on to adjournment. Motion to adjourn. Moved. Seconded. All those in favor? Thank you very much. Meeting adjourned.